This episode is sponsored by Relogic Research. Relogic is an engineering, aerospace, and technology company dedicated to solving our nation's toughest defense problems while investing in the bright minds of Huntsville. Relogic is excited to be a part of the innovation and continued growth of the Huntsville community. Visit their website today to see what they are excited about at relogicresearch.com, and all of this information will be in the episode notes. Well, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited that y'all are here today. Would you like to introduce yourself, and we'll kind of get started there?
Yeah, absolutely. Lucia, you want to start?
Sure. I'm Lucia Cape. I'm the Senior Vice President of Economic Development at the Huntsville-Madison County Chamber.
And I'm Erin Koshiet. I'm the Executive Director of Cummings Research Park, also located at the Huntsville-Madison County Chamber.
Well, excited for y'all to be here. There's a lot to talk about. I actually have papers in front of me for not the first time on the podcast, but definitely not something I do often. But there's a lot to talk about, so I don't want to miss anything. Before we talk a little bit about the current status of economic development, the present, the future, and everything in between, I think it's important to set up the conversation of who y'all are, y'all's background, kind of prior to the chamber and kind of your work experience. So are y'all originally from the Huntsville area? What sort of is your background that kind of helped you get the job you have today? And then sort of what was your career path to lead to the chamber?
Sure. I'll start. I'm older than Erin, so a little bit longer history. I am what I call a typical Huntsville resident. I'm not from here, but I had a lot of touch points along the way. My father was Army, and he was stationed at Redstone actually 3 times in his service career, twice that I lived on the Arsenal. And after his last tour of active duty, he and the family moved back here. So I was a frequent visitor after high school and throughout college in my 20s, and moved back myself permanently about 22 years ago. So
Okay.
I am now
Pretty much a Huntsville native. Pretty much a Huntsville native. You've seen all the growth. You've seen a lot of it, and you've been able to kind of touch it along the way. What about you, Erin? What's your background prior to what you do today?
So I also am not a Huntsville native.
Okay.
I think you'll hear that from a lot of folks here in
Yes.
Huntsville. But we moved here in 2006. I moved from the Washington, D.C. area, but grew up in Nashville, so just up the road.
Okay.
And met my husband here when we both weren't living here. And so this was a great place for us to come. And we actually moved here to raise a family. That was, to get out of kind of the DC hustle and bustle, and to be able to raise a family and then be close to family, but
sure.
not in the same city as family. So, and I grew up in the South, so it was great for me to come back to the South where everyone smiles at you on the street.
Yes.
And get a little bit out of that hustle and bustle of the DC area.
Yeah, for sure. So what was y'all's sort of career path to lead up to the chamber? Because I mean, it's not something you just get the job of senior as like that title you have, Lucia, is not something you just get from like your entry level position. It's something that takes a little bit to get to that. What was sort of your career path for both of you to get to where you are today?
Well, I started in journalism initially out of college. That was my degree. And with a degree, if you can write, you can do a lot of different things. So I did a lot of different things throughout my 20s. I worked here in Huntsville as a technical editor for an environmental services company supporting the Army. So got to learn the acronyms and kind of the way that things worked back then, and went back to graduate school to get a master's in public administration. I at that point thought I wanted to work for the government, either state or federal government.
That's what you do in Huntsville?
Well, that's what you do. And I really wanted to work in policy and program implementation.
Okay.
So my degree prepared me for that, and I actually worked for the Centers for Disease Control for a few years after graduate school. Loved that job, loved the opportunities there, but loved my husband more. And we moved. I moved from Atlanta to Huntsville when we got married, and worked in that field of writing and doing communications for NASA.
Oh, wow.
After I moved here, and then had the opportunity to move into their education office doing workforce stakeholder engagement.
And this is for NASA at the time?
It was for Marshall Space Flight Center and the community here. And the program that I was working on got a little bigger than NASA wanted to be responsible for. And so we took it to the chamber and said, is this something the chamber would want to take over? And they said, sure, would you like a job?
So around what year was this that you kind of made that transition from Marshall Space Flight to the chamber?
That was 2006.
Okay. So you've been in the chamber ever since.
Yes.
Wow.
So I started in workforce, and that was, at the time, it was a pretty new area. You didn't hear workforce all the time like you do now. And I was hired specifically because of the pressures of the 2005 base realignment and closure.
Okay.
A lot of companies were concerned with our low unemployment and a lot of really high-paying jobs moving in from DC that they were going to be ransacked. So we started doing a lot of recruitment and a lot of career awareness among students and recruiting college students from the area to stay here.
Wow.
And
this is in early 2000, like 2006, 2007. Like it's interesting. And we had someone on recently talked a lot about, the work from home that she does in her career. And it's like, she was doing that in 2010, which is such a unique thing too, because it seems so common now. And like workforce now, it seems very common. Like obviously the whole idea of economic development is to get people to stay here that are here and to get new people to come here to stay here too. Like you want people that are good, talented, and through UAH, whatever it might be, to stay here and work here and to not leave to go somewhere else. And that idea is so common now, it's thrown around so much. And then you were doing that in 2006, 2007, 2008.
Right. Yeah, so we have done this before. That's what I tell nervous employers. We've done this before. We did it in the 60s.
Yeah.
We did it in the 2000s, and we'll do it again.
Wow.
So continue to recruit.
Yeah. So, and what sort of was your career path from, coming from DC to coming to Huntsville? What was your career path to lead to now kind of being over Research Park?
Well, it started in Nashville, actually. So I graduated from Lipscomb University in the late 90s. And my PR degree background, I was traditional PR, and worked for a publishing house initially, really helping to get authors into bookstores and get them visibility for their new books they rolled out. And then back in the day, you looked for jobs in the classified ads in the newspaper. And I answered one of those that was really generic, didn't mention the company name, mention the type of work and where it was located, which was in downtown Nashville. And ended up getting that position with a company that was called, at the time, Aikens Public Strategies, and doing traditional PR, but then it merged. It became much more focused on state government, and then regional economic development advocacy. And that same company, which ended up being called Aikens Crisp, led me to DC and to run the DC office for them in the early 2000s timeframe. And then I was able to open an office in Huntsville for them as well, and that's kind of what brought us here. But that really was much more about, at that point, it had merged and evolved into this high-tech issues advocacy and doing campaigns in multiple states and with some federal government agencies. And so it was much more broad. You looked at kind of all the different elements of a campaign, not a political campaign, but if you're talking about advocacy campaigns on particular issues and changing that narrative. And so I did that work. I worked with a number of the companies in Research Park, over the years. Some of them had been clients. The previous CRP directors I had also worked with, and I'd gone on their tours and listened to their tours and their stories. And so I had those relationships. I worked with Lucia at the time on a workforce grant we were doing across the valley. So, had just kind of had really, put my toe in a lot of different areas that thankfully I've been able to tap into in this position. So joined here in 2015.
Okay.
And what she didn't say is I had to track her down.
It was a little tough to land her.
we had the opening and we had advertised it. And we had just launched a request for proposals on a master plan update for the park. And I was like, I can't do this. We've got to get somebody in here to run this shop. And we had posted the position and we had done some interviews and just couldn't find that right person. And I had crossed paths with Erin in this workforce program and at different chamber of functions. And I said, well, she's currently employed, but let's give her a call. And sure enough, it worked out.
There you go. And so you've been here ever since.
That's right.
And so I think what was interesting, and as I was planning for this podcast, we had the materials kind of far as like, what has Huntsville done economically? And you look at a timeline, it's from the 60s to now, and there's quite a few huge things that have happened here in Huntsville. And I mean, I wanted to dive into every little thing and talk about everything, but I think it's important for me to kind of think about, what are things that I've seen a lot in my lifetime to really have an impact and how they're continuing to have an impact. And so I'm going to reference the timeline just so I can get dates correct. So Cummings Research Park obviously is a big part of this conversation today, and it was originally founded in like the 1960s. And when I think of Research Park, I think of AdTran as kind of being that center staple. And then kind of around AdTran, it's just blossomed and everything from there. As you've kind of continued your role with the Cummings Research Park, how has the companies that you've landed and the companies that are in at Research Park helped other companies say, hey, I want to be a part of what's going on there?
Sure. I think that companies value and recognize the history, that long-standing success. I think they value and recognize that the city and the county and the chamber were all part of the narrative of creating Cummings Research Park, and the fact that that happened 60 years ago and is still very much the way in which it operates and plans itself. I think companies that are there and companies that are looking at coming really do value that. And so, our companies in the park do amazing things, tackling, global challenges, right? And for us to be able to utilize that, to talk to companies that are in that same space, the technology that you find at AdTran and some of our other commercial entities are recognized and valued, by companies in other industries. The same could be said for aerospace and defense. As we stand today, CRP is the, largest park focused solely on, aerospace and defense. It's been that way since we were created. However, you also sit here today and you go, yes, but there's also, biotech, and you talk about Hudson Alpha and Aviagen, and you talk about AdTran. AdTran sits in the center of the park. They really were that first company that said, we are going to really do an intentional effort to create this campus environment, this built environment that creates a culture for our employees. And so I think they have really been the star that all companies are wanting to become.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, was it tough during COVID when, you have that collaborative nature that you've created with the park? You have all these companies that are located into one area. If issues happen within outside of an expertise, you have people within the park to kind of, reach out to. It might be your neighbor, it might be someone down the hall. How was that tough to kind of navigate that when COVID happened and people aren't really coming in, and really now where that work from home is an option for many people?
I think one of the benefits is when you look at the companies that are in the park, a majority of those companies cannot do that work from home.
Yeah.
And so I think that was something as kind of how do we utilize community resources like what the Chamber was doing during COVID, like what Hudson Alpha was doing during COVID, and be a resource for companies as they are navigating this and creating that culture, or trying to. It went from we need to figure out how to continue to do the work to, okay, now we have a different culture. We have some people working from home. We have some people that are in the office. Everybody feels a little more dispersed. And how do we make everybody feel a part of the same team? I know we at the Chamber did several things during COVID to try to do that.
Yeah.
And so I think for us, a lot of times it becomes, how can we connect you to resources that exist? How can we connect you to expertise that exists? And to be able to help support the challenges that you have. And I think that's what the park has always done a really good job of. And I think, we saw that during COVID. And then I think we still see that today.
Yeah. And over the years, over the last, probably even in the last, 10 years or so, there's been quite a few companies relocate to the park. There's also been a lot of new companies that have, opened their first operations here in Huntsville. Blue Origin is in the park. A lot of companies that were located off of Wynn are now moving into the park. As far as the park's, footprint, is there much of the park left for, growth, or is it kind of what you see today is what you're going to see for a little while?
So the great news is there's plenty of space.
Okay.
So Lucia mentioned and referenced the master plan that was done in kind of the 2015, 2016 timeframe, and it really did look about the next 50 years of success for the park. And so today the park is 3,843 acres. We have a little over 200 acres undeveloped.
Okay.
But and we know that based on the changes that were done with the master plan, we have the ability for that to last us a while and to really be strategic and intentional with the types of companies that we recruit to the park. And what we have really invested time and effort in is to redevelopment of CRP East, which is the oldest
Okay.
section of the park. So you see things where you've got, UAH doing some of that. You've got the Arcadia. You've got the Alabama School for Cyber Engineering and Technology in Northrop Grumman, and several others that are redeveloping those facilities and those campuses in East. And I think that's where you're going to start to see us have even more of a balance. We're really going to look at redevelopment. I think that's a great opportunity to respect the heritage and legacy of the oldest
sure.
park, but make it relevant for today's marketplace. And then I think you'll also see us, continue to recruit companies from outside of the market, into the park and looking at those areas for development. And I think we've got spaces and places for all sizes of all companies that can work and that are the right fit for the park and can take advantage of the different elements and partners we have.
Yeah, and I think that's like, I think if anything's come out of COVID as far as the workspace is redefining what the workspace is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think having a space that is fit for any size company and having that space too for a company to grow and be able to stay a part of the park is huge. Because I mean, it's one thing if you're a company of 3, it's another thing if you're a company of 300.
Right.
And the spaces for both don't look the same.
Right.
And you talked a little bit about, you highlighted a little bit about it just a second ago about just, the master plan, about these things just didn't happen overnight. It's not just a coincidence that these things are happening. Y'all have been planning this. Lucia, I know when I was looking at the timeline, it was interesting to me to think about some of these things like Toyota that came in the early 2000s, when I think of Toyota just being here, in the last 5 or 6 years. What does that process look like behind the scenes prior to when it's announced that something's coming? Versus, what the public eye gets to see, like as an average consumer like myself.
Yeah, there is a lot of behind the scenes before it's public. That's a big part of our work, covered by confidentiality agreements. And if it gets out, then that's a bad day. So before an announcement, before the job announcement, or before a groundbreaking or ribbon cutting, it's typically a year plus of work directly with a company. In some cases, it's years of work, and it's building relationships, and it's finding new opportunities. The project with Aerojet Rocketdyne, that was in the work for about a decade through different leadership, different business opportunities, and when they decided to split into aerospace and defense, that gave us the opportunity to recruit their defense headquarters here, along with their manufacturing. So that was not a 1 year or even a 2-year process. That was multiple years of meeting with, building trust, and educating their team, their board of directors, their decision makers about our community, and really continuing to show that we were a good partner. And every project, every win that we have does that for the next one. It shows a continuity and a support. We're not just here for the announcement. We're here for the ongoing success of the company. So looking back through 2010, since 2010, the manufacturing growth that we've seen is not only remarkable, but as you mentioned, very intentional. We realized as a community we had a lot of really high-paying white-collar engineering jobs. We had a lot of entry-level service-type positions, but we had a big underemployment. We had a lot of people working not to their full potential. We had a lot of people that could be working in manufacturing, but the jobs just weren't there.
For sure.
So we made a concerted effort to recruit manufacturing jobs, and then we saw that started probably in 2011, 2012. And by 2015, we were starting to reap the benefits of that with Polaris and GE Aviation and Mazda Toyota and Facebook and other big name projects that came along because we had started putting the infrastructure in place for big manufacturing projects. That Western corridor out by Greenbrier, that had been master planned years earlier to be an industrial corridor. The workforce systems we put in place with our 2-year programs and with our high schools to get students aware of and interested in manufacturing jobs. So all those pieces took several years of laying the groundwork before those announcements started happening.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the chamber's really playing chess. You're not playing checkers. You're really trying to move things in the right order, and there's a rhythm and a rhyme to everything that you do. How has these conversations with potentially new people that, obviously you can't talk about right on air now, but how are these conversations going with potentially new people or potentially people that have come to Huntsville in the last few years? How is that credibility that Huntsville kind of has economic wise helped land these bigger industries, these bigger companies a lot easier than maybe what it was when you first came here?
Well, mentioning the Toyota example, so they came 20 plus years ago with the engine facility. That has grown multiple times since then. New lines, new work, larger footprint. And that relationship that is nurtured year after year with Toyota helped us land the Mazda Toyota project joint venture because they knew we were committed and we were good partners, and that they could trust the community when we said, we want you to be successful and we're going to work with you beyond the announcement to do that. So that's a really good example of that relationship and that trust being built over many years.
Yeah. And I mean, like looking at the timeline, I thought was super interesting too, is something that, has happened really in the last 2 years, I guess, which was Huntsville's International Airport approved for nation's first public spaceport. And then you look at the other end of the timeline and it's Huntsville International Airport opens at the Huntsville Jetport, and that's in the 1960s. So
Right.
how does, something like that, which is, it's not even, was it something that was even on the radar of like potentially this could be possible for Huntsville? And when did that become like, hey, this is something that we could actually land and accomplish here in Huntsville that's never been seen before?
That process started in 2015 as well. So
Really?
even though the FAA permit was issued a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, the process started years earlier with the realization that there was this new technology that could land on a runway, that we had willing partners to put up the initial investment, because it's even getting to that point was a huge investment.
Oh yeah, for sure.
The city and the state. So working together, working with the airport, working with our local companies involved in this work, the city, the state, the county, getting everyone to understand that this was a huge opportunity and was going to take some investment and take years. We needed to get through a permitting process that had never been issued before.
Yeah.
NASA was just ahead of us with the vehicle, so we stayed half a step behind. So we didn't have to completely plow new territory, but it really was a first, and it was an example of the type of innovation that this community not only is capable of, but seeks out.
Yeah.
So tying some of our commercial space aspirations to landing a space vehicle here. And that's just one piece of a bigger aspiration of growing the commercial space market, developing customers for low Earth orbit and on-orbit platforms like the commercial station or even vehicles that just stay in orbit for a period of time. So growing that market so that we can grow that business here and attract more companies that work in that space was the reason we pursued that landing permit in the first place.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy to think about. These. I think from my point of view, and I think from maybe a lot of people that are listening, I growing up, I always Huntsville's a place for engineers. What you do in Huntsville is you're an engineer. You go to school, you get an engineering degree, you stay in Huntsville, and you work as an engineer. That's what you do. I think a lot of things you highlighted with Research Park too, Erin, it's like, there's a lot of things here that are beyond just being an engineer. The workforce you've created, the workforce that was intentional in design, is making it it's adequately supporting people that can do multiple different careers and still stay in Huntsville and enjoy what the city has to offer. I was looking for the piece of paper. I didn't print it off, but there was a list of all these different sort of workforce areas that you've seen grow over the last few years here in Huntsville. What has been like that the high? I mean, obviously, engineering is a huge part. Defense contracting is a huge workforce area for Huntsville. But what has been these areas over maybe 2010 to today that have really been intentional for the chamber to kind of see grow besides just the manufacturing and what Toyota's brought to Huntsville?
I would say it's a cross-cutting focus on innovation and problem solving. That's not just the engineers who map out the solution, but it's the people who are thinking and applying new technologies. Right now, artificial intelligence is a big focus.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out where do we go with this and how do we utilize this for the missions on the arsenal for the commercial objectives of our companies and in the community. So being able to be creative, and you look at our community and you look at the things that aren't just engineering, or as you say, beyond rockets. The music scene that the city is cultivating now, the art scene that we have here is remarkable.
For sure.
You don't get to innovative solutions through just math. You get to them through this integrated approach that I think Huntsville is just a great example of. And it goes back to the Von Braun days when he said, we need not just the university and the research park, we need the art museum and the symphony.
Yeah.
And then you look to more recently to Jim Hudson's investments in this community, the Biotech Institute, but also Low Mill. I mean, these things all play a part in being able to cultivate innovative solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So not just fix this one problem, but how do you take this emerging technology and leapfrog some other things that have been obstacles to better everything.
Yeah.
There's just not, I think that's one of the great pieces of Huntsville and Huntsville's fabric is that it's not just centered around one industry or one type of job. It is incredibly diverse. And I think that you're now also seeing, I say now, but certainly within the last decade, you see companies that are not only in one industry. You see companies that are not only government contractors, right? You see companies like CFD Research who had been very government focused, now also in biotech, now have a robust internal R&D program that allows their employees to create companies and then, roll those out. So you start to see companies that were once in this very traditional, space start to take that creativity, take those solutions and apply those in other industries. And I think that also speaks to some things that make Huntsville special. Yeah.
And I mean, I think the ability to pivot, like not because of, lack of need in that field, but just of where the trajectory of Huntsville, the economy is going, being able to pivot in another direction is a huge skill that, the great companies do have. And if you're able to pivot in that direction and still be successful, I mean, that's huge. And I think, what Huntsville's created with the research park with,
CFD
being right there by Hudson Alpha and like this whole ecosystem is just, I think for the local, the Huntsville native never left, never probably will leave, which is fine. I love Huntsville. I think it's sometimes you take for granted. It's just like it's what you see when you go to work. It's what you drive by every day. Lucia, thinking back, and this is an interesting question, but thinking back to kind of your, you talked about having your dad stationed here a couple of different times. Then you come back. You always kind of had a little touch of Huntsville in you, kind of just for prior to being here full time. Really, did you when you were maybe your first experiences with Huntsville? Did you see that Huntsville had that potential, that canvas ready to be painted into something that what it is today? Or did that ever cross your mind until maybe when you moved here 20 years ago?
I would say in my 20s when I was here, it always felt like we were just almost there, almost there with a lot of things. And at the time, I was not heavily involved in our economy. It was more from a 20-something's perspective of is there
things to do? Yeah. And the answer was probably no.
There were a few things. There were things that were, smaller scale. And I think because that is part of our recent history, we talk about the scene at the time, the Tip Top. People that went to the Tip Top, we all still know each other. We all are doing other things in professional roles, but we had that common experience, and you always felt like Huntsville was just about to make it. And now that we are making it, we are seeing, we have so much talent here across different arts, not just the music scene, but to be able to look back and say, we had that then. It just needed a place to grow. It needed some support. And I think that's something that the city is doing really well, is saying, not we're going to make this culture, we're going to support this culture and let it develop. being data driven. I think that's something that Huntsville brings to any situation. We do it at the chamber a lot. We do a lot of studies to inform our decision making. The city did that with the music audit. They didn't just say we're going to spend a lot of money on music. They said, what do we have? What do we not have? What are those key things that we should do first? And using the information to make the investments. I think that's pure Huntsville.
Yeah.
The data-driven decision-making combined with the innovation is something that we can really say makes a difference here.
Yeah, and I think it's unique from my perspective, talking with a lot of different people. I mean, often I have people on that, they're not a Huntsville native either. They've just, moved here in the last few years. I then get to, like educate them on, when I was growing up, it was this. And it wasn't like that far along, but it's just a unique perspective. But I think you now see a lot of that reemergence of people that, maybe grew up in Huntsville or lived in Huntsville when they were younger that are now moving back because of what Huntsville has, strategically created and strategically kind of helped curate and blossom over the years. And it wouldn't be possible unless those investments were made in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and even probably before then, that are really coming, that are just all stepping stones along the way to get you to where you are today. And we talked a lot about, the strategic plan, from 2010 to kind of 2022. I mean, looking at these numbers, 30,500 new jobs, 26% employment growth. I mean, these are things that not are unheard of, but are just astounding just to see, and like I said, the numbers being such an important metric to look at and to address. I think I'd be remiss to not address, what obviously this episode is going to be one of the first episodes of 2024, which is crazy to think about. Looking at 2023, if kind of in the rearview mirror, we're recording this December 1st, but 2023 is in the rearview mirror. What does 2023 look like from the Chamber of Commerce's perspective, from Research Park, from economic development? What does it look like, and what could, maybe the people that, there's a lot of, not noise, but there's a lot of things that have happened. It's hard to consume it all. Like, what would be the highlights you would say from 2023?
I'll say 2023 so far, we still have a month. It's not been a remarkable year in job announcements. It's not been, we've seen actually a lot of growth, a lot of new investment from existing companies. But coming out of COVID and being able to be as strong as we are now, and getting the interest that we are getting from companies that aren't here currently. These are all really good indicators that we've got a stable path going forward. You don't want continued explosive growth.
Yeah,
you gotta.
That's hard. That's hard to maintain.
Yes, and it's hard to do right by your existing companies, and that's something that we've been really committed to, is making sure the companies that we committed to in the last 5 years are being successful. And between COVID and with some national and global employment challenges, we wanted to make sure that our existing companies had what they needed, that our recruitment efforts and our workforce development efforts were serving them, and that going forward, we're positioned to find those things that are value added to our existing market. Not just we need another big company announcement, we need another 1,000 jobs. We don't. We just need things that are going to make it a good, continued, solid growth, to help support what's already in place. And the people that we're recruiting, we're actually pretty selective about who we recruit.
Okay.
You want people who are going to value what Huntsville has to offer.
For sure.
Having lived in big cities, we're not in Atlanta, and we
don't really want to be.
Don't want to be in Atlanta. And people who love being in Atlanta, maybe they're not going to be happy here. But if they're tired of the traffic and all the things that come with being that large, we're a good alternative. And I know there are a lot of people who, like me, 20 years ago, have made the move and been really happy about it. And that's, I think, we get people here who are happy to be here. It's a welcoming environment. Anytime we have groups come in from outside, they accuse us of staging things. Like,
this can't be like it is all the time.
They're really skeptical in the beginning.
And with social media, that kind of gives people a platform to complain. So you see a lot of that about the growth, about traffic. About
Oh yeah, I mean,
things.
I thought it was funny that the traffic, average commute was on the paper, and I was like, I should highlight this, but I was like, I already had Dennis Madsen on. I've done the traffic analysis,
Yeah.
but I think back to what you were saying, it's as far as very selective on who you are recruiting. I think it's almost just as important as it is to land a new one. It's probably even more important to keep the ones you currently have.
It
And I think
really
for
is.
credibility, and I think just as far as growth, you don't want to see something fall apart that then these companies that have put so much into Huntsville having to leave because we're not able to support what they have.
Exactly.
And then landing the ones that help support the future growth strategically. Like I said, it's playing chess. You're not playing checkers. I think it's a mindset that's tough to sometimes balance. You're kind of doing a little bit here and a little bit there, and you're trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. But like you said, coming out of COVID, being able to kind of just support the ones you have and make sure they are successful is huge. As far as from the Research Park perspective, I mean, 2023 was a huge year. I mean, y'all are able to host the Paracycle World Cup. What did 2023 look like for Cummings Research Park, and what is the future sort of as far as maybe other events, or maybe what does being beyond just an area that houses a bunch of different companies?
Yeah. So I think, I look at 2023 as the first half of 2023 and the second half of 2023. The first half of 2023 was all about events. I mean, from planning to execution, a vibrant and connected community inside the park was part of our master plan that we developed. And it is something that day in and day out and every year we are thinking about. We wake up thinking about it. We go to sleep thinking about it. Really creating that vibrancy inside the park, and that looks different depending on who you are inside the park, right? So the first half was about events and the Paracycling World Cup. We were so honored to be able to have the opportunity to win that. We had done several national paracycling races to kind of test the water of what that really looked like, what that meant, what the community needed to do to support those cyclists. And so that was another real big test. I mean, the good news is it went off with flying colors.
Yes.
And we still have team managers from other countries talking about Huntsville and how they supported the cyclists and the events, and it was just fantastic on so many levels, never of which would have been probably envisioned back in 1982 when CRP West was created, that we're going to create it for a place to do cycling races, particularly for those that are visually or physically impaired, right? But yet here it is, and it turns out it's the perfect place, and we have wonderful partners not only across the city, but certainly in the park who just embraced it. From the very beginning, and so that's really exciting. I'll talk about that again in a minute. But the second half of 23 have been a little bit more in the planning stage. Is really substantial and foundational initiatives that the park really needs for its success and for its future. And so the second half has been head down planning for those. Those are not things that anybody talks about right now. They're not anything that that you see. They're certainly not sexy. But they're necessary
for sure.
And so that's what the second half of 23 has been. And I look forward to finally being able to talk perhaps about them in 2024 at some point.
Yeah, it's that difference between working on the business and in the business.
Yeah,
like the first half, you were very much in the business. You were doing the things that you had to do. You were planning. You were executing. You were doing all those, and now you're having to kind of, okay, we did everything that we had planned for, years in advance. We executed those. Now let's figure out what the future looks like, and let's kind of plan those. Let's put the infrastructure in place that can support those things, because it's not, like I said, it's not something that just happens overnight. And then I think that momentum is a huge part of any business. The momentum that you end 2023 in is the same momentum you begin 2024 in. 2024 for both y'all's perspectives. What are some things momentum-wise, just growth-wise, just initiative-wise that you can address, you can talk about, obviously, for 2024 moving into the new year?
You go first.
Let's see what you say, and then I'll say
and
something.
then I'll say something else. So for 2024, I think we started to see, this in 2023, our companies expanding, our local companies expanding, and I hope that we'll have the opportunity to continue to have that conversation with companies. I think for the park, we're really looking at where do we go next? What do we do next? What does that look like?
Mhm.
And so I think you'll hear about that in 24. What does it look like next? I think 2024 is that pivotal year for us as we really get towards the end of 24. There are some big things that we hope to see happen in 25 and 26.
Okay.
And which sounds really crazy that, we're kind of planning like that, but
You kind of have to.
you kind of have to for what, we want to accomplish, and it'll take us that long. And it'll be here before we know it.
Yeah.
So I think those are some of the key things that I'm really excited about as we, roll into and through 24 is being able to take advantage of those. We'll have a new website in 2024, and while that may seem small, it's so huge because with a fully functional and capable website, there's a lot that we can do that we currently don't have the ability to do. So.
There's one thing when you create the content and you have the content. There's another thing about being able to deliver the content and being able for someone to consume the content.
Yes,
that's the content's only as good as the number of people that consume it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
it's different, right?
It's different. It's different for everybody. And the way they consume it is differently.
Right.
And I think that's like a big, I was talking, when we were talking in the magazine I had on yesterday, they're talking like a lot about, physical things. There've been a huge growth since COVID, I think a little bit, but there's also the way you do digitally has also completely changed. The way people consume content has completely changed, and being able to reach them where they are is the important factor. Lucia, from your perspective, what does 2024 look like in some, things that you can address?
So one thing that is front and center for my mind is the commercial space.
Okay.
What is happening in vehicle development, market development, what NASA is doing with Artemis, making sure that they've got those pieces in place to support their second launch. We just last month celebrated the 1-year anniversary of the first launch. And these are the kind of things that when you look back 20 years from now, you'll say that was monumental.
Yeah.
And while we're living through them, it's like, yeah, that's cool. But monumental, to be living in times that will be considered monumental is pretty humbling. And we are on the cusp of a lot of development
Okay.
that space will enable. Looking at some of the things like the inventive agricultural
Okay.
companies and technologies that Hudson Alpha is facilitating right now. I think being in the middle of a time like now that has so much potential change, you don't realize the kinds of things that are going to come out of it. And I
For
think
sure.
Being aware and agile and open to those things, like I mentioned AI, we're working through right now. How do we as a chamber, how do we as a business community address what this might mean to us in the long term?
Yeah.
How do we embrace whatever is going to happen with electric vehicles?
Yeah.
Environmentally, there are some realities. Technologically, there are some realities that we don't know what they are yet. But we've got to stay flexible. We've got to stay aware, so that that we're on the right side of things when they do come out. So it's an awareness right now. It's, like I said, being agile and able to pivot, as you mentioned. Looking back through the decades and seeing those moments, in black and white it's important to realize that we're in those times when we're in them.
Yeah, and I think it's hard. It's that, that the hindsight, you're like, oh, obviously those things would have been amazing for Huntsville. Why didn't I think of that when I first came here? Like, it's easy to think of those things, but it's also like it's cool for me, and I think it's interesting for really anybody. I mean, us looking at the timeline is like, what is going to be the things in 2020 that are on that timeline that we then get to look at in 2030?
Right.
Like, what are those? Like, if you could put 3 things, like, what are and I don't know if we've accomplished everything that might be on there. There might be some new things that happen, but like, what are those things? Like, obviously, like, you look at it, like, oh, the arsenal was huge. Like, obviously that should be on there. Like, all these things, like, these, like, very obvious. What's going to be that obvious thing in 5 years that we say, oh, that has to be on the list. That has to be on the timeline. I don't know.
Well, we were just at the Redstone update on Wednesdays of chamber event that brings in the leadership from Redstone to talk about, what they're dealing with right now, what their reality is. And, the reality is there's a lot of technology that needs to be integrated into existing programs. That is something that we do all the time
Yeah.
in Redstone. The amount of advanced technology that's being developed and integrated right now, people outside the arsenal don't understand.
Yeah.
And, some of it they can't really talk about. But on our website, there's a link to all the presentations. It's mind-boggling, the amount of really high-tech work that's being done out there. And, we talk about national security, we talk about global security, we talk about intergalactic security going forward. Redstone has a key role in that, and by Redstone we mean the greater Huntsville area.
And it's in our backyard, which is also something that I think I think it's something that maybe I probably have taken for granted growing up. It's not something you're just like, oh, it's the arsenal, like it's just the arsenal. Now it's like, wow, there's a lot that is happening behind those walls. There's a lot of things that are happening that are things that are going to directly affect our lives, that are going to directly affect our future, that are directly going to affect the economy here in Huntsville. And I think there's just so much exciting things to talk about. And hopefully, like I said, we'll hopefully have you all on in a year from now, we can address some of the things that you couldn't address today. But as we always end in the last question of the episode, if anyone's listening and they want to find out more about the chamber, they want to find out more about Research Park, where can they find out more information and connect with you?
Smartplace.com is our economic and workforce recruitment and development site.
Okay.
We have as much information as we can fit on that site. It's geared in one respect to companies that are here that are looking to be more successful or to expand, and companies that aren't here that are interested in locating here. The other piece of that site is for people who are interested in locating here or helping recruit their friends and family from across the country. So we welcome ambassadors who will work with us to recruit people here. As I said, it's it's special people that want to be in Huntsville and that will be happy here.
Yeah.
A smart place is not just a website for us. It's a description of this community, and I think it attracts the kind of people that our companies need. And our website is full of the information that anyone listening can use to help us further that goal.
Perfect. Yeah, and we'll have. And is there anything directly for the Research Park that people can find out more information?
So we have CummingsResearchPark.com is really the one-stop shop for all things Research Park. From the standpoint of from our history to the tenants that are there, ways you can work, live, learn, play, all inside the park. How you can connect and find partners. And so it really is that go-to resource to find out what's going on and ways in which you can plug in or know about or be able to experience, as you mentioned, being able to attend things out there.
Perfect. Well, we'll have all of that information in the episode notes. So if you're listening and you want to follow the links to all of those things that they mentioned, we'll have all those links below. But thank you for spending the last almost 50 minutes talking to me a little bit about the Chamber of Commerce, economic growth here in Huntsville, Cummings Research Park. I'm excited for the growth that we're going to have, the growth that we had in 2023, the growth we've had over the last 10 years, and the future growth. And we'll definitely have to have you all on again in a few years to kind of address some of the things we couldn't do today. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.